What if the South had won the Civil War? What if the thing that decided whether the United States stayed one country or split into two came down to a lost piece of paper wrapped around 3 cigars? What if the single most consequential battlefield discovery in American history was made by a corporal who almost didn't bother picking it up? What if there had never been an Emancipation Proclamation because the battle that gave Lincoln the political cover to issue it had simply never happened? Because here's the thing people get wrong about the idea of the South winning the Civil War. We imagine it as some grand, sweeping military triumph, Confederate armies marching into Washington, the Union simply outfought and overrun. That version was never realistic. The Confederacy never had the population, the industry, or the railroads to conquer the North outright, but there was a real, narrow, well-documented path to Southern independence, and it didn't run through Washington at all. It ran through London and Paris, and it very nearly happened in the span of about 10 days in September of 1862. So Jimmy, quick history refresher before we get into it. By the summer of 1862, the war has been going for over a year, and it is not going well for the Union in the East. General George McClellan's massive Peninsula campaign to take Richmond has collapsed. Confederate General Robert E. Lee has just crushed a second Union army at the Second Battle of Bull Run in late August. Confidence in Lincoln's administration is cratering, both in Congress and, more dangerously, overseas. Britain and France have been watching this war with intense self-interest the whole time because both countries depend heavily on Southern cotton for their textile industries, and both governments have influential factions openly arguing for recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation and pushing for a negotiated peace that would end the war on Southern terms. Lee knows this. So in early September 1862, riding the momentum of his victory at Bull Run, he makes an aggressive call. He invades the North, crossing into Maryland, hoping a major Confederate victory on Union soil will do two things at once: sway the upcoming Northern midterm elections toward the anti-war Democrats, and finally push Britain and France into formal recognition. Here's where the single most contingent moment in the entire war happens. Lee splits his invading army into several columns to simultaneously besiege Harper's Ferry and screen his advance, and he issues detailed written orders to each of his commanders, laying out the entire plan, known to history as Special Order 191. A copy of that order, for reasons nobody has ever fully explained, ends up wrapped around 3 cigars and left behind in an abandoned Confederate campsite near Frederick, Maryland. On September 13th, a Union corporal named Barton Mitchell finds it lying in the grass. Within hours, it's in the hands of General McClellan, who reportedly says that if he can't whip Bobby Lee now, he's willing to go home. McClellan now knows with total certainty that Lee's army is dangerously scattered across multiple locations, ripe for being defeated in detail before it can reunite. McClellan, being McClellan, still moves too slowly to fully exploit it, giving Lee just enough time to concentrate his forces near a creek called Antietam outside the town of Sharpsburg. On September 17th, 1862, the two armies collide in what remains to this day the single bloodiest day in American military history. Over 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in about 12 hours of fighting. Tactically, it's close to a draw. Strategically, it's a Union victory, because Lee, having failed to destroy McClellan's army and unable to sustain the invasion, withdraws back across the Potomac into Virginia. And that withdrawal is the hinge everything else swings on, because 5 days later, on September 22nd, Lincoln uses that narrow strategic win as the platform to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. From that point forward, the war is no longer just about Union. It's about slavery, explicitly and publicly, which makes it politically toxic for Britain, a country that had abolished slavery in its own empire decades earlier. To formally recognize the Confederacy without triggering a massive domestic backlash. The road to European intervention effectively closes at Antietam, and closes because of a document Three Cigars almost got smoked with. So here's our divergence point, and I want to be precise about exactly how fragile this chain is. It is not one battle. It is one piece of paper in one abandoned camp found by one soldier who happened to be paying attention. What if Corporal Mitchell doesn't find it? Or a Confederate straggler retrieves it first? Or it simply gets tossed on a cook fire the way stray paper in an army camp usually does? It's not a stretch at all. Without Special Order 191, McClellan has no idea Lee's army is fragmented. He continues his historically documented pattern of extreme caution, wildly overestimating Confederate troop strength and refusing to press an advance without what he believes is overwhelming force. Lee completes his planned movements at Harper's Ferry, capturing an enormous Union garrison and a huge haul of supplies and artillery, and reunites his army on his own schedule rather than being forced into a rushed defensive stand at Antietam. There is no scrambled, costly battle along Antietam Creek. There is instead either a continued, undisturbed Confederate campaign through Maryland and possibly into Pennsylvania a full year before Gettysburg historically happens, or Lee, having achieved his supply objectives, withdraws on his own terms with his army intact and his reputation as the dominant commander in the East fully burnished. Either way, Lincoln has no battlefield victory, however narrow, to hang the Emancipation Proclamation on. Historians, including Lincoln's own cabinet members writing about this at the time, have been explicit that Lincoln was waiting specifically for a Union success before issuing it, because he didn't want it to look like the desperate last gasp of a losing side. Without that moment, the proclamation gets delayed, softened, or shelved entirely, at least for the critical months when European recognition is most live as a political possibility. Let's sit with what that actually means, because Britain in the fall of 1862 was not a passive observer. Prime Minister Palmerston's government was seriously, actively discussing joint mediation with France to end the war on the basis of Southern independence, and it was Antietam, followed by the Emancipation Proclamation, that took the wind out of that push. Remove that sequence, and you're looking at a Confederate battlefield performance through the autumn of 1862 that keeps British and French cabinets leaning toward exactly the kind of formal recognition and mediated peace they were already flirting with. That doesn't necessarily mean British troops fighting alongside Confederate ones. It almost certainly does mean diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, international pressure on Washington to accept a negotiated settlement, and quite possibly naval support in breaking the Union blockade that was already strangling Southern trade, since protecting that cotton supply was the entire British economic motive in the first place. Here's the part that matters for how the war actually ends, because a Confederacy that wins international recognition in late 1862 or early 1863 doesn't need to conquer Washington, it just needs to survive long enough, with enough outside legitimacy and enough war weariness building in the North, particularly after the staggering casualty numbers already piling up for Lincoln's political position to become untenable. The 1862 midterms, fought without a moral rallying cry like emancipation and against the backdrop of a war that increasingly looks unwinnable and internationally unpopular, could easily hand the House to peace Democrats. From there, the path runs through negotiation rather than conquest, a mediated settlement likely brokered by Britain and France that recognizes Confederate independence roughly along the lines already held by Confederate armies by that point. The 11 seceded states, possibly with contested claims over Kentucky and Missouri, left to some future arrangement. So what does the world actually look like with two American republics instead of one? Slavery is the first and most brutal thread to pull, because a surviving Confederacy is a slave-holding nation born at the exact historical moment the rest of the Atlantic world is turning hard against the institution. Britain abolished slavery across its empire in 1833. France did the same in 1848. By the 1860s, the Confederacy isn't just an outlier, it's swimming directly against a current that will only get stronger. That doesn't mean slavery ends quickly inside Confederate borders. If anything, a victorious, internationally recognized Confederacy has every incentive to entrench it further, constitutionally protecting in the way the actual Confederate Constitution already did, and likely pursuing the antebellum dream of the Golden Circle, expanding the slaveholding zone south into Cuba and parts of Central America to secure new markets and new territory as cotton prices fluctuate and soil exhaustion continues to erode southern agricultural land, a real problem the historical Confederacy was already grappling with. But here's the twist, and it's the one people miss when they imagine Confederate independence as some permanent, thriving, alternate nation. A confederacy that wins in 1863 still has almost none of the underlying advantages that made the United States an industrial and demographic superpower. The North kept the overwhelming majority of American railroads, factories, banks, and population. A newly independent confederacy is a large, agrarian, cotton and tobacco economy with a tiny industrial base, dependent on European capital and European manufactured goods, essentially locked into the same colonial-style economic relationship with Britain that the antebellum South already had, just now without the protective tariff structure and internal market the Union provided. Economically, the Confederacy likely becomes something closer to a client state of British finance and British industry than a true independent superpower, its cotton exports and its debts both flowing through London. Meanwhile, the United States that remains, minus the South, doesn't collapse. If anything, it industrializes faster and more completely, because the political fights that historically slowed northern industrial and infrastructure legislation, fights the South consistently won in Congress for decades before secession, simply disappear along with Southern representatives. The Transcontinental Railroad, homestead expansion, protective tariffs for northern industry, all of that moves through a Congress with no Southern bloc to obstruct it. You could very plausibly end up with a United States that reaches its historical industrial and territorial peak on a similar or even faster timeline than it actually did, just permanently smaller in population and land area, and permanently haunted by an unresolved war next door. Because that's the other piece nobody should skip past. Two nations sharing one continent with an open, contested border, an unresolved and morally radioactive institution of slavery on one side of it, and millions of enslaved people with every incentive to flee north does not produce a stable peace. It produces exactly what the antebellum period already had, just with an international border attached. Fugitive slave disputes escalating into diplomatic incidents, border raids, competing claims over Western territories like Kansas and the New Mexico Territory, and a confederacy desperate to expand its slave economy running directly into a United States with no interest in letting slavery spread into shared Western space. Historians who've mapped out this scenario generally land in similar places, either a series of smaller wars over the following decades as both sides jockey for territory and the unresolved slavery question keeps reigniting, or, further out, an eventual second war, possibly decades later, once northern industrial and population advantages become so overwhelming that reunification, forced or negotiated, becomes achievable in a way it wasn't in the 1860s. There's a global angle here too that's worth sitting with, because an America divided against itself is an America that isn't projecting power the way it historically did. The United States that intervenes decisively in the First and Second World Wars, that becomes the arsenal of democracy and later the anchor of the post-war global order, is a United States built on the industrial and demographic base of a reunited nation stretching coast to coast. Split that base in two, with the Confederacy's cotton-dependent economy contributing essentially nothing to hemispheric industrial capacity, and the northern remainder permanently smaller, and the balance of global power in the 20th century looks fundamentally different. Maybe a still powerful but less dominant United States, maybe Britain and a unified Germany play larger roles for longer, uncounterbalanced by the sheer scale American industry historically brought to two world wars. It's genuinely an open question whether the Allied side even wins the Second World War the way it did if the version of America available to arm and supply it has missing a third of its historical landmass and a huge chunk of its historical population base. And underneath all of that, the moral reckoning simply gets pushed later and gets uglier. In our actual history, slavery ended through total war and constitutional amendment, brutal and incomplete as the aftermath of Reconstruction still was. In a world where the Confederacy survives as its own nation, that reckoning doesn't disappear. It just changes shape and gets delayed, playing out through decades of international pressure, economic isolation as the rest of the world abolishes slavery and then colonial forced labor around it, and internal contradictions inside a Confederate economy that was never actually built to sustain itself without either constant territorial expansion or eventual wrenching internal change. Whether that reckoning arrives through gradual economic collapse, through internal uprising, or through a second war with the United States that never stopped viewing the Mason-Dixon line as a wound rather than a border, is the kind of question that could fill an entire second video on its own. There's a piece of this that rarely gets talked about, which is what happens to the West once there are two competing American nations instead of one. Historically, the Civil War actually accelerated westward settlement. The Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad both passed through a wartime Congress, specifically because Southern representatives who had spent years blocking free soil land legislation to protect the political balance between slave and free states were gone. In a divided America, that fight over the West doesn't resolve, it just moves. A surviving Confederacy, hungry for new slave territory to replace exhausted cotton land in the Deep South, has every reason to push claims into the New Mexico Territory and possibly further into a Southwest that, in our actual history, briefly did see a small Confederate invasion in 1862 before Union forces turned it back at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, without a decisive Union victory forcing Confederate withdrawal from that entire theater. The contest over Arizona and New Mexico stays alive for years, dragging in a United States that's simultaneously trying to manage relations with native nations across the plains without the manpower or unified national will it historically had since a chunk of its army and its political attention is now permanently tied up watching a hostile southern border instead of a rebellious internal one. The human cost of stretching this war out longer or reigniting it in a second round decades later is also worth pausing on, because we sometimes talk about alternate history in such abstract, map-level terms that it's easy to forget the 600,000 dead is already the actual number from the war as it happened. A version of this conflict that ends in negotiated stalemate rather than unconditional Union victory doesn't necessarily mean fewer deaths along the way to that outcome. And if the unresolved tension between the two nations produces a second war within a generation, the eventual butcher's bill for North American disunion could end up considerably higher than the war we actually got, just spread across two conflicts instead of one, with a functioning system of chattel slavery persisting in between them for that much longer, and that much more human suffering compounding every year it continues. It's also worth asking what happens inside the Confederacy itself once the adrenaline of independence wears off, because the Confederate government that Jefferson Davis presided over during the actual war was already straining badly under the exact contradiction that independence will only make permanent, The Confederacy was founded explicitly on states' rights and resistance to centralized federal power, and yet fighting and then governing a war required exactly the kind of centralized taxation, conscription, and economic control that half its own founding ideology rejected. Davis spent much of the real war fighting political battles with his own state governors, men like Georgia's Joseph Brown and North Carolina's Zebulon Vance, who resisted Richmond's authority on principle even while the war against the Union was still being fought. An independent Confederacy doesn't make that tension disappear, it just removes the external pressure that had been holding it together. You could very plausibly see a nation that spends its first decade of independence fighting internal battles over centralized power, tariff policy, and how to fund a government without the kind of unified national market the United States had. The same fault lines that, historically, some Confederate leaders themselves worried might eventually pull their new country apart from the inside even if it won the war outright. What I keep coming back to with this one is how the entire fate of a continent came down to a strip of paper that should have been destroyed, sitting in the grass long enough for one corporal to notice it before someone else burned it for warmth. Lincoln gets his narrow victory at Antietam because of 3 cigars nobody smoked, and from that one accident, the modern United States, industrial, unified, eventually powerful enough to help decide the outcome of 2 world wars, gets built. Take that piece of paper out of the equation, and the map of North America, and quite possibly the balance of the entire 20th century, gets redrawn from the ground up. Until then, this is Cody of Alternate Ages.